Hi, I'm Brian Klontz, President of the Emergency Assistance Foundation, Inc., and this will be the first in a four-part series on emergency assistance funds for employee hardship and disaster relief. In part one, I'm going to talk about the definition, the history, the benefits, and the current status of having an emergency assistance fund. So the first part is the definition. So to be very clear about what emergency assistance funds are, they are typically employer-sponsored funds for two distinct purposes. The first purpose is for disaster relief, things like a tornado or hurricane. Hurricane Katrina was an unfortunate example of that recently, where the employers' employees are affected, and the employer itself, as well as fellow employees, want to be able to help. So that's a disaster relief fund. The second distinct type of fund is an employee hardship fund, and that would be some hardship like uninsured medical bills, utility assistance, rental assistance, military deployment, any kind of hardship that frankly would be a personal disaster to the person, but would not necessarily be a natural disaster, is another way that employers try to help. So the second area to cover is the history of these funds. There's certainly been a long history of employer-sponsored philanthropy, and it really came in two forms. The first form is the disaster relief, where typically a disaster would occur, and an employer, including the employees, would make contributions to benefit the victims of that disaster. So again, Hurricane Katrina or the tsunami relief or the Haitian earthquakes would be great examples of that. However, that's typically done for the class of individuals that were impacted, not necessarily just the employees of the employer. So the disaster relief activities that most employers have would be what I would call a more formal approach, where grants are made to other public charities like Red Cross and other disaster relief charities to benefit the class of impacted individuals. The second way that employers and employees have made contributions for emergency hardships are for when fellow employees are impacted by some emergency, whether that's a medical emergency or disaster that impacted them specifically, or rental assistance, any kind of emergency. There's an informal approach, and that approach really is what I call the pass the hat. It is Susie in accounting has been impacted, we're taking a collection for her, and we want to be able to provide her with some kind of help and support as she's going through this particular time. So now that we've covered the definition of emergency assistance funds as well as the history, it's probably most important now to cover the benefits. Why would any employer want to set up a fund like this? And there are really 6 distinct benefits. The first benefit would be improving employee morale. And when you know that your employer is supporting you if you had a specific emergency, and your fellow employees are doing the same, and you're able to make contributions for your peers, that really builds the morale within the company overall and really makes it feel much more like a corporate family. The second is more practical perhaps, and that is helping employees get back to work faster, not only physically, but mentally. So if an employee is going through a particular hardship, and knowing that they're able to have direct employer support through an emergency assistance fund allows them hopefully to put that disaster or tragedy behind them sooner and helps them be a more productive employee quicker as well. The third are charitable deductions, and this really occurs at 2 levels. One, assuming that it's a public charity receiving these gifts, anybody making contributions can get the maximum charitable income tax deductions for each contribution made. And the second component of that is, if it is sponsored by a public charity without any employer control, then the grant recipient, the person who receives the actual grant award, would receive that completely income tax free. The fifth benefit is the low cost of these programs. When you think about many of the programs that exist today, many of them are predominantly funded by the employees themselves. So many employers will provide certainly additional funding or matching of the employee contributions, but to a great extent it's a benefit funded by the employees for fellow employees. And the final benefit really is retention. It really does get back to the notion that if you're working with an employer who cares, with peers who care, for any instance that comes up that might be impactful to you, understanding that you really are a family, and as we say at our foundation, charity does indeed begin at work. So next we'll talk about the current status. So what is the landscape of these funds nationally? Very interestingly, we've actually reviewed over 100 programs that exist, and while that may seem like a lot, in fact it's a very, very small proportion of larger employer groups. And by employer groups we mean corporations typically with 10,000 employees or more, or governmental entities, or charities, things like colleges and universities as an example. So through our research over the last 2 years, we found that roughly 5% of all Fortune 1000 companies have either a disaster relief fund, an employee hardship fund, or a combination of the two. When you look at government employers or charitable employers, again primarily universities, it's closer to 1 to 2% of the total group have both disaster relief and or emergency hardship funds. So most of the programs that exist today were really created because of some natural disaster that impacted employees. And most others, when we talk to, why haven't you started a program? Most would say first, they just frankly don't know where to start. And two, the deeper they get into it, they become much more concerned about the tax considerations, the operational considerations, and just really trying to understand how best to administer the program at the lowest effective cost. So I hope this has been helpful in better understanding both the definition of emergency assistance funds, both for disaster relief and for employee hardship, also understanding the history, the benefits, as well as the current status.